lot of engineers think that asking questions is a more junior skill. And in fact, ironically, a lot of junior engineers or entry-level engineers don't ask enough questions. They feel like there may be an expectation to know everything, and that imposter syndrome sinks in. I'll share that my first manager I ever had as a software engineer told me that I should be asking 10 questions per day for my first couple of weeks. It's the first piece of advice I ever got as a software engineer on the job, and it was very valuable. It really set me free to ask all the questions that I needed to ask. So I really appreciate that manager. The other piece of advice he always had too, or this was a mandate, honestly, was always write the test that breaks your code before you write the code. To which I said, my code breaks without any tests. So the third piece of advice, which was also important, was be wary of that self-deprecating humor, because not everybody's going to get it. Stories aside, we're here to talk about how to ask questions better in order to change how you think about code and change how you think about architecture. So I won't necessarily be getting into code. I won't necessarily be getting into how to architect, but I'll be getting into how to ask those questions that will help you now in the future and help you to help others in the future as well. A lot of times junior engineers struggle not just because they don't know what to ask, it is that, but also because a junior engineer more than anyone else thinks there's an expectation that they know everything. Mid-level engineers sometimes struggle because they ask too late. They do understand that they're not expected to know everything, but they do also know that they're expected to be able to operate a little bit more independently, and so they may wait too long and stay stuck for too long before asking questions. Senior engineers may struggle because they ask questions in the wrong way. And then staff engineers actually, we're going to flip, and even to a degree with a senior engineer. It's not so much about the questions that you're asking about your own code, it's how you're asking questions about how others code. And then that way, they can shape the outcomes through the questions that they ask. So it's not necessarily whether you're asking questions, but it's how your questions evolve as you grow. If you think about it, the questions that you ask are part of your feedback loop. Better questions lead to better signal leads to better decisions, and over time, that's what drives growth. The type of questions that helps at one level doesn't work at the next. There's a really great book out there that if anyone's thinking about growing their career in any field, it's What Got You There Won't Get You Here. So when you're trying to move to that next thing, the level of your questions need to improve as well. So let's walk through how this changes as you go from junior to mid-level to senior to staff. At the junior level, your goal is clarity. You're learning systems, you're learning patterns, you're learning how things fit together. So a good question can sound like this. Can you walk me through how this part of the system works? What does success look like for this task? What should I prioritize if I run into multiple issues? These questions are good because they reduce ambiguity early. One of the measures of professional development is managing ambiguity across all different types of roles. That doesn't mean you always have to guess or interpret your own version of what to do in an ambiguous situation. Sometimes it means at an early stage, ask to reduce the ambiguity as much as possible before moving forward in a task. These types of questions show that you're aware of your gaps, and it is important because they can prevent rework. These types of questions will keep you from having to redo something, especially what does success look like for this task. You may have a senior engineer or your manager may have a very clear idea of what they want. Sometimes it's up to you to ask some questions to make sure that you are aligned with that very clear idea. The most common mistake at the junior level is waiting too long to ask. getting stuck for hours or days because you don't want to interrupt somebody. But asking early is not a lack of skill, it's a form of ownership. As you move into a mid-level role, the expectation will shift. Now your goal is ownership. You're not just completing tasks, you're responsible for delivering outcomes. So your questions should start to look different. Instead of asking, what should I do? Start asking things like, here's the approach I'm thinking about. Does this align with what you had in mind? Or are there edge cases I should consider before I start? Or what risks should I be aware of here? The difference is subtle but important. You're no longer just asking for answers. You're bringing a point of view. You're thinking ahead. The common mistake at this level is asking open-ended questions that push the thinking onto someone else. You want to own that thinking. You want to own that process. Mid-level engineers should be reducing the load on their team, not increasing it. At the senior level, the goal shifts again. Now it's about leverage. You're not just evaluated on what you deliver, you're evaluated on how your thinking improves the outcome of the team. So your questions become more strategic. You might ask, what problem are we actually trying to solve here? What trade-offs are we making with this approach? How will this decision affect the team in 6 months? These questions don't just unblock work, they shape decisions. These are questions that can be asked during grooming sessions, when you're talking with a product manager or even a business owner. These questions also sometimes will help that product manager or the business owner or the client better understand what it is that they want. By asking better questions, you will eventually create a better product for your client, your manager, your product manager, your business partner. One of the biggest mistakes senior engineers make is answering too quickly. So this is a case when someone else asks a question or you see a problem and you know the solution and you jump in. But sometimes the higher leverage move is to ask a question instead. Senior engineers don't just solve problems, they clarify them. At the staff level, the shift is even bigger. Now your goal is direction. You're operating in ambiguity, you're working across teams, and your questions create alignment. So you might ask, what are we optimizing here for? Where are the teams currently misaligned? What decision would make this easier for everyone involved? These questions aren't just about the work, they're about the systems around the work. Staff engineers use questions to clarify the boundaries, not just within a single problem. There's an important trap that can show up with questions with the senior and staff level. At this point, so senior staff level engineers will be asking more junior level, mid-level and junior engineers questions about their code. There's a trap that we can fall into if we're not careful, and I've done it myself more than once, and I'll do it again, even though I fully am aware of the dangers. The leading question. This is an example of when the question is actually just an instruction in disguise. For example, have you tried just catching the result here? It sounds like a question, but it's really not a question. It's a directive. The problem with this is subtle. It removes the thinking from the other person and it creates dependency. It limits learning. It also signals something unintentionally. I already know the answer and I'm not really interested in what your thoughts are. And we don't want to give that signal to junior engineers, otherwise we'll never have mid-level engineers. There's a better way to approach this. Instead of jumping to a solution, you can guide the thinking. For example, what options have you considered so far? What trade-offs did you see with those options? What do you think would happen if this scaled? That's one of the questions that always hit me. What would this be like with 1,000 users, with 10,000 users, with 100,000 users, with 1 million users? How would this change? That's one of the most important questions we can ask ourselves. So changing the tone and fully asking those questions to guide a thought pattern rather than to ask a question to guide someone to a specific answer that you've already thought of, you're helping someone build their own reasoning. You're building independence, and that's a very different kind of impact. If you want something practical to take away from this, here's a simple framework you can use. Think of it as a question ladder. When you're helping someone or even thinking through a problem yourself, move through these steps. First, clarify understanding. How are you thinking about this problem? Second, explore options. What approaches have you considered? Third, evaluate the trade-offs. What are pros and cons of each? And only then, if needed, guide the thinking. What might happen if we tried this approach? Most people skip straight to the last step. We are quick thinkers as engineers. We are quick to having solutions when we've been doing it for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. We've solved similar problems before. We have a whole toolbox of what can get fixed. But the real value here is helping others build that toolbox. And we can do that through guided questions. So here's a simple way to reflect on this. If you're an individual engineer, ask yourself, am I asking questions to get answers or to improve my thinking? And if you're a senior staff engineer, you ask yourself, am I teaching or just directing? Because those are not the same thing. The goal isn't to ask more questions. The goal is to ask better questions, because the way you ask questions shapes how people learn. It shapes how you learn and how decisions get made. And ultimately, better questions can shape how teams grow. If you found this useful, try this week. Pay attention to one question you ask in a code review, in a meeting, when you're stuck. Ask yourself, did that question get me an answer or did it improve my thinking? The small shift is where a lot of growth starts. If you want more content like this, focused on how engineers grow over time, feel free to like this video, subscribe to get more content. And remember the ABCs of coding: always be coding, and sometimes always be curious and ask better questions. Thanks, y'all.